Challenges and opportunity of hybrid imaging. Here my disclosure. Quantification in PET-CT imaging has been challenging since the beginning as metrics used for quantitative evaluation have shown strong dependence on different factors, not always easy to control or evaluate. Moreover, there are a lot of corrections that can be introduced in PET-CT reconstruction. We have already introduced the single correction, the scatter and random correction, but we need to consider also attenuation correction, partial volume effect, movement effect, and obviously time of flight correction. The number of measured counts actually deviates from the real integral function that represents the distribution of radio tracer due to a series of physical effects. They may result in poor image quality and also in non-accurate quantification of common metrics like SUV. In PET, as in nuclear medicine in general, some of the emitted photons will be attenuated by the patient and hence will not be detected. One of the most important corrections for quantitative nuclear medicine imaging is the correction for attenuation. Here we can see an attenuation corrected image and the corresponding not corrected one, in which we see the effect of attenuation in the inner part of the patient, in particular in the abdominal regions, and also some artifacts in the head and neck regions. Attenuation correction in the past could be performed in two different ways, for PET-only scanner or hybrid PET-CT scanners. In the first case, the measured emission data were pre-corrected with the attenuation factors. These factors could be derived from a transmission scan. This way to correct for attenuation nowadays is practically obsolete, but still used in small animal PET. The second way is performed by forward projecting the attenuation map, which represents the spatial distribution of the attenuation coefficients into the sinograms. In PET-CT, the map valid for PET is derived from diagnostic high-dose, contrast-enhanced, or low-dose CT images by converting the Hounsfield units to the values for 511 keV photons, using a piecewise linear calibration curves. Before applying the conversion procedure, the CT images must be adapted to the PET resolution by a Gaussian filtering and downsampling. This second method of correcting for tissue attenuation incorporates directly the map into the iterative reconstruction. If we consider an annihilation event in a point of the object, we see that each of the two annihilation photons travels through the patient body along the distance d, and is attenuated according to the law of attenuation of radiation in matter. Attenuation depends first of all on the path of the origin point, and it also depends on the linear attenuation coefficient that can be evaluated with the acquisition of a CT of the same object. Attenuation correction is applied directly on the sinogram, and we can see the effect on a regular cylindrical phantom in which we have a uniform distribution of radioactivity. The first image shows the raw sinogram. Then we apply the singles correction for the sensitivity of each detector, but the reconstructed image of the phantom is not uniform, as radioactivity seems to decrease as we move towards the phantom center. But if we take account also of the attenuation the radioactivity distribution is correctly uniform. Attenuation depends only on the depth of the origin point and on the linear attenuation coefficient that can be evaluated by the acquisition of a CT of the same object. We can see in these images, on the left the not corrected image, that on the right has improved just with the application of correction coming from the CT of the same patient in the same position. The accuracy in quantification will also increase, as we can see for the two small lesions with the faint uptake shown on the left and a much more intense signal on the right. As already seen in the cylindrical phantom, attenuation has an important effect on quantification. For example, a length of 15 cm, that is more or less the medium diameter of the head, leads to an attenuation factor of 4.5, and the length of 35 cm, such as found in the abdomen, results in a factor of 18. Thus, only 22% and 5.5% respectively of the radiation emitted by the radiotracer is recorded by the PET detector. The possibility to use the CT acquisition to correct for attenuation passes through the conversion of the acquired CT linear coefficients to the corresponding coefficients at the energy of annihilation photons. The mathematical conversion of the coefficients is based on the curves shown in the picture that represent the Compton the photoelectric effect contributes to the attenuation as a function of the photon energy. We can see that at 511 keV we have almost only Compton scatter, while photoelectric effect is more important at lower energy. In PET-CT modality, we can also use a contrast medium to improve the quality of CT component, but in this case there could be an overestimation of the conversion factors, and some authors suggest not to use the contrast-enhanced CT to correct for attenuation. Using contrast-enhanced in practice, the conversion from CT numbers to attenuation coefficient for PET data correction is achieved by applying multilinear scaling methods. These methods generally work well with soft tissue and also for bone structures, but could result in overestimation of attenuation for application involving CT contrast agents, as the contrast agents usually are designed to have a high absorption rate for CT photon energies. Here we can see this effect. We have two uniform objects with the same activity concentration, but one of them is filled with the contrast medium. The object profiles of radioactivity concentrations are the same in the not AC corrected reconstruction, while on the right we see that an artifact is introduced by applying the AC correction using a CT in which one of the two objects is filled with the contrast medium. As a result, the corrected activity in the contrast medium object is overestimated compared to the other object. The effect of the use of contrast-enhanced CT for hybrid imaging has been studied in many papers, and typical artifacts of this effect are well described in publications. Usually, these kind of artifacts are well recognized and they do not impact on reporting, in particular in oncological application of hybrid PET-CT studies. So attention to this effect must be paid in reporting for this kind of acquisitions, as usually an accurate visual examination of both images, PET and CT, can identify these artifacts. This is a PET CT study of a patient with esophageal cancer and lung metastasis. On the left, no contrast medium has been used in CT, while on the right, a second CT with the contrast medium is displayed and also used for attenuation correction. Ansfield numbers of subclavial vein and heart are 36 and 35 respectively on unenhanced CT scan, and the corresponding value for contrast enhanced CT are 1090, 962 and 260. The corresponding PET standardized uptake values were 0.97 and 188 in the first case, and 1.3 and 2.45 in the second. So an increase in SUV max of 60% and 43% has been introduced by the use of enhanced CT for correction. Besides these results, the authors concluded that although there's a significant increase in SUV when contrast enhanced CT is used for AC, this increase is usually clinically not significant. When there is a diagnostic need to perform a contrast enhanced CT in a PET CT study, one way to avoid CT-based AC artifacts due to contrast medium is to perform a low-dose non-contrast CT that can be used for AC first. Then, following the PET portion of the exam, a second contrast-enhanced CT can be done for diagnostic purposes only. However, depending on the CT parameters used, this dual CT approach usually results in an increase in the radiation exposure to the patient that have to be considered. But this is the most common choice in these situations. Other artifacts can be introduced by correction for attenuation with CT. The most common are due to the presence of oral implants or in general of other metallic implants. Another typical situation in which the correction for attenuation introduces artifact is associated to the transaxial field of view of CT that is usually smaller than that of PET for commercial PET CT systems. As a result, the anatomy covered in PET imaging could be truncated in CT, especially for large patients. Also, these truncation artifacts, due to truncation of part of the body in large patients, are well known and are associated to a lack of information of the part of the body that lay out from the CT field of view. Also, patient motion between CT acquisition and the following PET acquisition can introduce artifacts. This is another typical artifact that we can find in hybrid imaging. It is an example of artifact due to breathing. In the CT image, the liver has a typical artifact that occurs when CT is acquired in free breathing, but the artifact is propagated to PET when using the CT to correct for attenuation, as the linear attenuation coefficients of the liver are applied to a part of the lung in the PET images. In general, movement can cause significant artifacts and distortion even in the area where lesions are present, leading to incorrect information on the size, the shape and the volume of the target itself. And obviously, these artifacts are propagated to PET and result in wrong quantification. Artifacts from movement will be discussed later in this presentation. Anyway, we have to consider that all these effects have a strong influence on quantification in PET. Correction for attenuation in hybrid PET MRI has been a challenge since the beginning of the introduction of this kind of hybrid scanners, and many different methods have been proposed and described in literature. The goal is to obtain the AC map from MRI images even if the MR signal is not directly correlated to the electronic density of the tissues as we have seen in CT. In the first option, MRI should be segmented into different tissues and then the corresponding attenuation coefficient is assigned to each tissue. To obtain a quantitatively accurate PET image, usually 5 different tissues should be discriminated as the difference between their attenuation coefficient are not negligible. And they are hair, lung, soft tissue, spongious bone and cortical bone. If the lung would be considered hair, it could cause an error of 25 to 40%, and also the difference between spongious and cortical bone can cause not negligible error if ignored. To discriminate the 5 main tissues in the patient body is not very simple. In fact, in conventional MR sequences, there is no contrast between hair, lung and cortical bone because their signal is too low. They cannot be discriminated based on the intensity of the MR image alone. Due to rapid signal dephasing of both lung and cortical bone in short T2 sequences, the signal sampling does not occur quickly enough after radiofrequencies excitation, as time to echo is too long. So, double echo sequences are used. A first image is acquired very quickly, between 50 and 150 milliseconds after the radiofrequency pulse, and the second gradient echo image is acquired after 2 or 3 milliseconds. In the image we see that the lung and cortical bone are visible only in the first image and can be discriminated both from soft tissue, visible in both, and from hair, not visible in both. Another way for attenuation correction in MRI PET scanners is to use a reference template. We first warp the PET or MR image onto a PET or MR template. Then we apply the inverse transformation to an AC template co-registered with the PET or MRI1. For example, the method proposed by Hoffman uses a T1 weighted MR image of the patient and a reference template consisting of multiple MR and CT images. Then we co-register all MR atlas images to that of the patient. We apply the same transformation to the CT atlas images, and finally we reconstruct a pseudo CT as a weighted average voxel by voxel of all the co-registered CTs. This is an easy method for brain acquisition, but become more complicated for whole body acquisitions. In this other method, we can use the Dickson sequence to separate water and fat by exploring the different Larmor frequencies of the photons in the two molecules. We use a different time to echoes and we obtain images of water and fat, and then by segmenting the images of water and fat we can classify soft tissue, adipose tissue and mixed tissue. One limit of this method is that information on the other tissues are missing, and this can cause possible artifact. Here we have an example where the SUV of 6 metastatic lymph nodes are calculated with the AC map obtained from the Dixon sequence, and they are on average 2.7% lower than that obtained by the reconstruction of the PET with an AC map from CT. The conclusion of the author are that this level of difference has led to no differences in the clinical interpretation of the images. Here an example of a difficult situation in which both CT and MR-based AC leads to artifacts. The transverse CT image shows a typical artifact caused by a dental implant. The corresponding CT-based attenuation-corrected positron emission tomography and also the fused PET-CT images show an artificially increase in FDG uptake in the adjacent soft tissue. On the other hand, the MRI-based attenuation correction map of the same patient shows a large region of missing data and tissue misclassification as hair around the dental implant. This misclassification is resulting in an artificially decrease of FDG uptake in the corresponding corrected PET image. The PET MRI image shows a severe artifact in the transverse T1 weighted sequence used for anatomical correlation. The depth at which the photon interacts with the crystal is associated to the spatial resolution of the system. We speak of depth of interaction, and different situations influencing the uncertainty in assigning a position to the photon interaction in the crystal can be described. The photon penetration can cause an incorrect assignment of the line of response if the depth of interaction is not considered. Also, the scatter within the detector results in degraded crystal identification, while statistical uncertainty reflects errors in the decoding process due to the statistics of the amount of light collected. In general, the fact that the interaction occurs deep in the crystal means that the line of response is not corrected. The evaluation of the depth of interaction is one of the challenges in PET-CT modality. In this picture, three of the many approaches for the depth of interaction detector modules. On the left, we have two layers of crystals that are offset so that each crystal is visible on a crystal map. In the center, light is collected from each end of the crystal, and the ratio of the light collected provides depth of interaction information. On the right, light is shared between paired crystals by modifying the common interface such that light at one end is not shared between PM tubes elements, while light on the other hand is shared at about 50%. The ratio of the light from the paired crystal provides the depth of interaction information. Another correction that has been introduced in PET imaging that is related in a certain way to the depth of the interaction and that is commonly available and selected as an optional correction in reconstruction is the point spread function correction. If we consider an annihilation event in the center of the transaxial field of view, we see that each annihilation photon is absorbed in the crystal in which it enters, as it is shown in the left of the picture. On the other hand, when annihilation occurs at the edge of the field of view, the photons are absorbed in a crystal that is different from the one in which they enter, and the line of response is assigned to the wrong position. The error in assigning the line of response depends on the width of the detectors, on their geometry, and the parallax effect. PSF correction incorporates information relating to the response of the PET detectors into the iterative algorithm, and modeling the point spread function can take into account all the characteristics such as the width of the detectors, their geometry, and the parallax effect. Moving towards the edge, the distance between the assigned line of response and the corrected one increases. This means that the signal from a point source results degraded in the radial direction. This effect on the point spread function has implication for the partial volume effect and in attempts to measure quantitative values. The inclusion of knowledge from the PSF measurements into the reconstruction algorithm may reduce the problem. The response of the detector as a function of position can be characterized with Monte Carlo simulation or experimental measurements. As a result, a spatial response matrix of the detectors is built and can be then integrated into the iterative algorithm. Over the last decades, PSF reconstruction has become commercially available in clinical PET-CT systems, and these systems have been shown to be more sensitive for the detection of small volume cancer lesions. This is an example of PSF correction. We have a line source of germanium 68 that is placed parallel to the scanner axis in 8 radial position, and the profiles of the counts are taken on the left with the standard iterative reconstruction without PSF correction, and on the right with PSF correction. And we see that the decreasing height of the different position moving from the center to the edge of the field of view is compensated with the use of the correction. The partial volume effect is a consequence of limited spatial resolution. PVE can lead to quantitative underestimation of activity concentrations in reconstructed images, and the smaller the detector, the less significant is the partial volume effect for a given object. Advances in PET system technology include the routine use of smaller sized detectors elements in whole body PET tomographs. In the 90s, PET detectors of 6 mm per 6 mm surface area were common. In modern systems, this crystal size is reduced to 4 per 4 mm, thus providing higher intrinsic resolution data and, as a result, improved recovery for given region. Here an example of the consequences of PVE on different sized lesions. On the left we see improved lesion recovery for smaller detector element, 6 mm versus 4 mm. It should be noted that the smallest 10 mm lesions are barely visible on the PET image acquired on the bigger crystal system. On the right we see the consequences of PVE on clinical PET images with an increased lesion recovery for smaller sized PET detector elements. Another important correction available on modern scanners is the correction for time of flight. We speak of TOF PET. Let us describe how it works. If the annihilation event is in the center of the field of view, the time taken by the two annihilation photons to reach the crystals at the end of the line of response is the same. Most of the events are not in the center and are distributed according to the tracer distribution in the scanned object. In conventional PET, the precise assignment of the emission point of the annihilation photons to a precise position is impossible, and the signal is therefore isodistributed along the entire line of response. If we were able to measure the difference of time, we could assign the event in the real annihilation point with a more accurate measure. This is what we do when we apply the time-of-flight correction. Time-of-flight PET was not applied at the beginning in PET imaging modality because the time resolution of BGO crystals was too long to allow a measure the very small difference in time. On the other hand, other crystals had an excellent temporal resolution but insufficient efficiency for clinical application and were never introduced at all. By using scintillation crystals with a very short decaying time coupled to fast electronics, it became possible to measure this difference in arrival time with a useful level of precision. PET systems that have this capability are known as time-of-flight systems. Many papers have investigated the increase in spatial resolution and improvement in quantitative evaluation of TOF scanners. The smaller the distance in time that can be measured, the more precise the spatial localization of the annihilation event will be. Increased temporal resolution is due not only to the use of different crystals, but also to the introduction of new electronics with the use of digital detectors. In BGO scanner, the correction for time-of-flight that was not available due to the long decay time is becoming available with the new artificial intelligence tools. Time-of-flight correction makes the system more efficient and less statistics is needed to reach a good image quality or better lesion detectability. Here the cylindrical phantom with 4 hot spheres with decreasing diameters positioned clockwise and 2 bigger cooled spheres, and the comparison between TOF corrected and not corrected images show significant improvements also with very low acquisition time. The gain in signal-to-noise ratio is proportional to the square root of the ratio between the transaxial diameter of the object and the spatial precision of the annihilation location, which is proportional to the timing resolution. The same phantom, together with the NEMA image phantom described previously, are used in this paper, in which the combination of point spread function and time-of-flight corrections are investigated. They both stresses the possibility to decrease acquisition time, keeping the image and the signal-to-noise ratio at a very good level. This is another paper in which the effect of corrections is studied, also with the PET MRI scanner and the use of a surface coil. They investigated the results in phantom and in clinical applications and found that the use of the coil decreased the quantification of SUV evaluation, but when time-of-flight is applied, the decrease in SUV values is less, and moreover the interpretation of clinical image do not change. Many papers are available demonstrating the importance of both correction also in clinical application. The popular OASI-M algorithm does not incorporate prior knowledge about the radioactivity distribution to be estimated, nor it is expected to converge. In standard iterative reconstruction, there are no constraints on the difference in intensity between adjacent voxels. Due to the ill-conditioned nature of the reconstruction problem, each iteration increases the noise in the image. In practice, OSEM algorithms are stopped after a fixed number of iterations and often are post-smoothed to control the high voxel level of variance. The resulting OSEM image is thus dependent on the choice of the number of iterations and subset, and also on the choice of the filter. An attractive approach to avoid excessive image noise in image reconstruction is to add a penalty term. If adjacent voxels have very different intensities, then the image is less favorable. This penalized ML approach requires a penalty to be defined and tuned to provide the desired noise suppression while retaining valid changes in voxel intensity from one location to another. Adding a penalty term is equivalent to extending the EM algorithm with prior knowledge using a Bayesian techniques. This is the Bayesian penalized likelihood reconstruction. In the formula used to reach convergence of the difference between acquired data and calculated image data is included a term that has the goal to reduce statistical differences between pixels. The only parameter that can be set by the user is a coefficient beta that in the algorithm multiplies the regularization term and which weights the regularization term as a function of counting statistic. This term is called penalty term, and it should be high where statistics is low, and vice versa, it is set at low values where statistics is good. The penalty term is designed in such a way as to keep the noise low and at the same time preserve the edge of the image with the help of the CT contribution. Also, this correction has been deeply investigated in literature. This is an example that compares in phantom and in clinical applications the use of different weighted regularization correction with the standard iterative correction and with the correction for point spread function. In coronal views, it is clear the change in image quality, for example, for uniformity in the liver, while in the corresponding axial views, the improvement in the small lesion definition is much evident and correspond to a much better quantification of SUV without any change in image noise when regularization is applied. Organ motion is another challenge that has been studied, and different solutions have been proposed to try to avoid artifacts due to breathing. The problem comes from the fact that the PET data are acquired for minutes to collect enough count statistics, while the CT that is used for correction of attenuation is acquired in free breathing, and this can bring artifact in the attenuation map, or on the other hand, if it is acquired in hold breathing, it takes the information only in one phase of the breathing cycle. Organ motion can compromise the lesion detectability, bringing inaccuracy in quantification of SUV values. There could be a misalignment between PET and CT, or a volume distortion with blurring and artifacts. A point source that should give a Gaussian distribution of the counts showed on the left of the figure when the point is moving during breathing lead to a different distribution on the right with the distorted shape and lower intensity. Motion is very important in quantification as the value of SUV decreases rapidly according to the displacement of the lesion during movement, as shown in this scheme. Here an example of a PET-CT study for characterization of a lung nodule. On the left, the standard acquisition in two different phases of the breathing cycle, where we can see that there is no correspondence between CT and PET components. SUV values are much different, while on the right the same study has been corrected for breathing movement, and the correspondence is much better, and also the SUV quantification is much increased, from a value of 3 in standard acquisition to a value of 4.2 in 4D. Both PET and CT of PET-CT study are performed during physiological movements of lesion and organ. The movement can be due to heartbeat, breathing, or general organ motion, but the most important factor degrading PET-CT images is breathing, and in particular it has an effect on the chest for lungs and lymph nodes, in the upper abdomen for liver, spleen, pancreas, and peritoneal lesions. This is another example, a clinical acquisition. On the left we have the standard acquisition, and on the right the 4D acquisition. In the standard acquisition in PET images we see one nodule, and in CT coronal images we see that the nodules are two, and the correction for movement in the 4D PET-CT acquisition show also in PET component the two separate nodules. These are other two examples for quantification of SUV in very small nodules. The first patient has a very small nodule in the right lung, and in standard PET the SUV of the nodule is 1.6, while in 4D PET it becomes 2.9. The second patient has already as well a small nodule in the left lung, and the value of SUV in standard acquisition is 2.0, while in 4D acquisition is 3.2. In this paper, the use of 4D PET in radiotherapy applications have been investigated. On the left, the clinical target volumes, on the right, the planning target volumes. Yellow are the volumes from a 4D acquisition, and in red the volumes from a PET standard acquisition. The knowledge of the real displacement of the target during breathing allows the reduction of more than 50% of the treated volume, with the result to reduce irradiated volumes and potentially the toxicity to the healthy tissue. In the same publication, another situation is showed for another patient for which 4D volumes are bigger than standard PET, and the knowledge of the target displacement during breathing improves the dosimetric coverage of the target during the treatment. Available literature has underlined some situations in which it should be very important to correct for movement to avoid mistakes in reporting or improve impact of diagnostic examination. Correction for movement should be taken into account when there is the need to characterize very small lesions, smaller than 1 or 1.5 centimeter. The organs in which 4D has demonstrated its importance are lungs and liver. It could be very useful to solve doubts in faint uptakes with SUV between 1.5 and 2, and also in radiotherapy applications to guarantee better target coverage and spare of organs at risk. In this paper, it has been described the impact of movement on spatial resolution of a system. Two systems with a spatial resolution of 5 and 12 millimeters respectively are compared, and loss of resolution measured as a function of a respiratory motion amplitude. They showed that the higher is the spatial resolution of a system, the bigger is the loss in resolution due to movement. So controlling the movement is needed to optimize the system performances. From a technical point of view, to acquire 4D acquisition, we use the list mode. That means that we record for each event not only the position, but also the instant, the energy, and the delay with respect to the trigger signal. We first acquire a CNST that is split in the number of phases in which we want to divide the breathing cycle of the patient. In the example in the slide, we have 6 phases. Then we acquire in list mode the PET counts, and with the help of an external trigger, we assign to each coincidence one of the breathing phase. And finally, we reconstruct the 4D PET using, for correcting attenuation, the corresponding CT phase images. The results of a 4D PET study are a set of PET images or PET phases representative of motion-free images at different moments of the patient's respiratory cycle. The 4D PET phases are not identical to each other but similar. To perform 4D acquisition, we need a system to trigger the breathing of the patient, a system that records a change that corresponds to a specific phase in the breathing cycles. Trigger systems can be, for example, a belt that records a change in pressure during the movement of the patient thorax. Another system used is an infrared camera that follows the movement of two radio-opaque markers that can be positioned on the thorax or abdominal regions according to the part that moves more regularly during breathing. And recently, a new technique to identify the breathing cycle of a patient has been introduced. It is based on the analysis of the principal components of the data in the sinogram, and this is a very important technique as it does not require any external device. Not all the studies and patients can be acquired in 4D. Some important indication that the 4D acquisition is not going to work and images quality will not improve depend on the regularity of the breathing cycles. With irregular breathing, there could be no improvements, as well as if the displacement of external markers is too short. Another important limit in the 4D protocol is related to the extra time that is needed to acquire data. As the counts collected during acquisition are split into the different phases, to get a result with a good count statistics, the time acquisition for each bed field of view must be calculated multiplying the standard duration with the number of phases. So if we usually acquire a standard field of view for 2 minutes, the total duration of the corresponding 4D field of view will be 12 minutes. This extra time in acquisition may result in pain for the patient, in particular in the back and or shoulders, could lead to progressive irregularity in breathing rhythm, with the consequence that the irregular cycles will be discarded and count statistics decrease. Due to the long acquisition time, it is important to pay attention to the patient positioning that should be, as much as possible, comfortable. In summary, the main advantages of a 4D acquisition are, first of all, the possibility to display the actual lesion volume and to follow the real movement of organs and lesions. The improvement in detection of small lesions, the quantification of organ motion, and the much more accurate of the displacement of the small lesions, and in particular when they are positioned in organs that move a lot during breathing. And finally, another advantage is to avoid, in general, all the movement artifacts. On the other hand, the main disadvantages are due to the long total exam duration, the dependence on the breathing regularity, and on an extra dose to patient due to the CNCT needed to correct for attenuation all the PET phases. As 4D acquisition can't be applied in routine for the described disadvantages, and for this reason new techniques for motion correction have been introduced, and movement is still an actual issue in new advances in PET technologies. One alternative technique to the 4D protocol is another technique with which we get a final result only one single set of images, free from movement and with good image quality. The main steps are similar to the 4D protocol, but the statistics in each phase can be much lower, as image from the different phases will be co-registered with elastic deformation. The main advantage of this protocol is the total time that is comparable with the standard protocol, but image quality is much better, as the final result is free from movement. The process, although shorter than 4D protocol, keeps the complexity of a 4D protocol and can't be applied in routine acquisition, but only in selected cases. Research in movement management introduced another type of protocol. The analysis of the respiratory breathing cycles show that most patients tend to spend more time at the end expiration phase and maintain the same position in this phase. Images reconstructed using only counts recorded in the end expiration phase should be less affected by motion. We see in the example the improvement in image quality and the absence of motion for the small lesion in the liver with this kind of technique. The last described technique has some advantages. First of all, it is easily implementable. It has no impact on acquisition time, approximately only 50 seconds added, and on the workflow. It does not require patient collaboration, but it has the disadvantage that is associated to an increase in dosimetry for patient, approximately 1 millisievert for the CNCT component. Up to now, motion correction keep being an issue, as movement introduces also artifact in image, as shown in these examples. This artifact could be crucial for correct staging of patient. In the example on the right, we see a large area with very low counts in the high abdominal region, but in this region the motion corrected image shows the presence of a small lesion that was not visible in the standard image. The last technological innovation introduced in PET scanning in recent years is the large axial field of view PET scanner. We speak of total body PET. Increasing the geometry coverage, these systems encompass the entire body of the patient, and their sensitivity can be increased by a factor of about 40 for total body imaging, or a factor of about 4 or 5 for imaging a single organ, such as the brain or heart. In this plot we find the history of the axial field of view length over the year for the PET scanner available. The first scanner PET available were scanners with less than 20 cm axial field of view. Standard scanners have now axial field of view of between 25 and 30 cm. The total body scanners can reach almost 2 meters of axial field of view. This has many consequences, but the first is a much relevant increase in sensitivity, and this brings many important advantages as reported in this paper. The increased system sensitivity paves the way for short-term, low-dose and dynamic total body imaging, as well as new examination methods in almost all areas of imaging. A large FOV PET brings the possibility of ultra-fast imaging, of low-dose imaging and delay imaging, and also total body dynamic imaging and parametric imaging. The main application can be in oncology, but also in studies that involve healthy participants, and in the evolution of deep learning tools. The authors of this summary report summarized the improvements and the advantages of the total body scanners in this way. The superior sensitivity of total body systems can be clinically exploited in various different ways. The faster image acquisition facilitates a higher throughput. Additionally, application of less radioactivity allows for PET study to be performed more frequently during the course of a disease or a treatment protocol. Together, these factors open the path for an easier and safer evaluation of new radiolabeled substances. Furthermore, delayed imaging up to 30 days post-injection give completely new insight into the biodistribution of new radiopharmaceuticals, and these qualities will open the door for new indication not presently feasible with the current state of art of PET-CT scanner. This is a short comparison between a standard PET and a large FOV PET according to the time to complete a total body study that usually takes between 10 and 20 minutes for a standard PET. With a large FOV PET it will take 15 and 30 seconds. The injected activity is much less for the total body PET, about 10 megabecquerels compared to the 200 till 700 megabecquerels. So the correspondent dose to patient is decreased. We speak about of 0.2 millisievert. The possible delay is another crucial and important point. For F18 with standard PET we can delay the acquisition till 6 hours after injection. With the large FOV PET this time can be increased to 18 hours, but also for other radioisotopes for which in standard PET no delay is possible, we could perform acquisition also 3 hours later for carbonium-11 and 18 minutes for oxygen-15. Some remaining challenges have to be considered also for the hybrid total body PET scanner. First of all, the patient compliance, because claustrophobia will be a more frequently observed issue with this kind of scanner. Motion correction is not completely a solved problem. We need very fast image reconstruction algorithm, as we have to manage a very huge quantity of data. And finally, we have to consider also the cost benefit balance as these kind of scanners have a very high cost, initial investment that is 4 or 5 times bigger than for a standard scanner pad. Thank you for your attention.